So good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to today's CEOS Cultural Economic Online Seminar, which is part of the activities of the Association for Cultural Economics International. I'm Elisabetta Lazzaro, CEOS Coordinator, Professor of Creative and Cultural Industries Management at the Business School for the Creative Industries at the University for the Creative Arts in the UK. Today's seminar will be on artists, labor markets, and social protection. We will discuss and compare different policies for social protection of artists, current challenges, and suggestions for possible improvements of artists' labor markets, including social security, health insurance, mobility, and corresponding legal frameworks. So I'm very pleased to introduce our speakers of today, comparing quite two different realities, respectively the United States and Europe. Our first speaker will be Joanna Woronkowicz, cultural economist specialized on artist labor markets and cultural facilities investments. Joanna is associate professor at the O'Neill School of Public and Environmental Affairs at Indiana University in the US, co-founder and faculty director of the Center for Cultural Affairs and co-director of the Arts, Entrepreneurship and Innovation Lab. The second presentation will be provided jointly by Frederic de Wispelaere and Marco Rocca. Frederic is a research expert at HIVA Research Institute for Work and Society at KU Leuven in Belgium, specialized on intra-EU labor mobility and EU coordination of social security systems and related statistics. Marco Rocca is permanent researcher in labor law at the French National Center for Scientific Research, CNRS, and affiliated to the DRESS research unit of the University of Strasbourg in France. Frederic and Marco are, among other projects, respectively coordinator and PI of the European Research Project Mobilive, dealing with the social aspects of cross-border mobility in the live performance sector in the European Union. So, Joanna, the floor is yours to start with. Then we will have Frederic and Marco. And in the second part, we will have a discussion between you and our audience. So please.
Thank you so much, Elisabetta, and thank you to CEOS for inviting me. Happy to be here. I apologize for my voice. It sounds like I am in my 20s and spent last night clubbing, but that's not what it is, just feeling a little under the weather. So I'm very happy to be here, and I'll go ahead and share my screen. Nice to see so many familiar names on the virtual seminar as well. So thank you, friends, for coming. So I will be talking a little bit about one of the papers that the email for the virtual seminar highlighted. And this is a paper that was published a couple of years ago already in the Journal of Cultural Economics on the effect of a certain healthcare program or healthcare policy in the United States on artist labor markets. As Elisabetta said, I'm an associate professor at Indiana University here, where we have our Center for Cultural Affairs, and I'm happy to see my co-founders and co-directors, Michael Rushton and Douglas Noonan, on the virtual seminar today. So thank you for being here. So I'm going to start with a quote. Before I go into the paper, I wanted to just provide a little bit on my perspective for why I study what I do. So this is a quote from a book that I'm currently working on called Being an Artist in America. This will be hopefully completed next year and published in 2024 by Stanford University Press. And it's really a book that's understanding how artists build careers in the United States specifically, and then how policies and programs can go about supporting artists. But the most important part of the book, I think, is in chapter 1 and the setup of the book for trying to answer the question of why why should we even care about supporting artists? Because at least in the United States, this is not necessarily a problem that the population would agree that is worth even caring about. So I provide a perspective in the book that I think is largely is a little bit different than how we currently think about the importance for supporting artists. And it's possibly reflected in this quote, where I argue that the current approach to valuing artists by focusing on their extrinsic benefits fails to recognize the complexities of engaging in artistic labor that are arguably more critical to understanding how to support artists. So in this book, I put forth an alternative perspective to valuing artists that prioritizes occupational motivations and behavior of artists. And then I demonstrate how understanding the ways that artists work can ultimately drive public policy and support the artistic workforce. So this is a very, I think, it's a nuanced alternative perspective. However, I think a very important one. We tend to value artists in the United States, at least, based on their extrinsic benefits or their apparent extrinsic benefits. So the things that artists can provide to make our world a better place. And if we're probably all somewhat familiar with the literature in understanding the causal effect of having artists as a worker and in the workforce that helps sort of better society, and the kind of questions we still have around that cause and effect relationship. So this perspective here is really thinking about, well, if we do want to design policies and programs to support this workforce, we ultimately need to think about how this workforce works, the behaviors, the mechanisms they use in order to make careers. And it's not a book that's advocating to support artists, but it's a book that's providing information for, if we do decide to support this workforce, how do we go about doing it? So with that, I wanted to go into this paper that I wrote a couple years ago, because it does provide one example for understanding the behavior of the artistic workforce, and then really analyzing that behavior to understand how a specific policy can or cannot support this workforce. So this paper was written by me and 3 health economists, Aparna Soni, who is at American University now and who was a PhD student at the time we wrote this, Seth Friedman, who's at the O'Neill School with me, and then Kosali Simon, who is a very well-established health economist who writes extensively especially on the topic of the Affordable Care Act. And so it was a really wonderful collaboration we had between me and these 3 colleagues. So the research question we tried to answer in this particular paper was, what was the impact of the Affordable Care Act on the health insurance of artist workers? So a little bit of motivation, especially for my non-US colleagues that are on the call. The institutional structure of healthcare in the US is such that it favors large employers and full-time workers. So most individuals in the United States get their health insurance from their employer. We do not have a nationalized healthcare system that's akin to Canada, for example, where I grew up. Artists in this respect are especially disadvantaged relative to other sectors of the workforce because so many artists tend towards self-employment and contingent work. So I believe at this point, there is an estimate, the estimate is about 35% or a little below 30% of artists who work as self-employed workers. And then we also have a contingent, we have a portion of those artists and additional artists that work in contingent work or work that is on short-term contracts. So that makes getting health insurance from a large employer or a wage or through a wage position difficult or challenging to do for many artist workers. So in 2010, the US Congress enacted the healthcare policy or program called the Affordable Care Act, also called Obamacare, since it was under the Obama administration, and then implemented this in 2014. And this program expanded health insurance availability in 2 ways primarily. One, by expanding Medicaid, which Medicaid is a healthcare program in the United States that targets individuals below a certain income threshold. And the Affordable Care Act expanded the healthcare availability in more than half the states through the Medicaid program, through expanding eligibility, and then also adding what we called a young adult mandate provision, which expanded access to individuals up to the age of 26. So formerly individuals up to, I believe, the age of, and actually don't quote me on this, I think it was up to the age of 18 or 19 could stay on their parents' health insurance, but the young adult mandate expanded that so that individuals up to the age of 26 could stay on their parents' health insurance. So there was these two major mechanisms for expanding healthcare access. Now, we actually don't know much about artists' access to health insurance in the United States. Several reports, primarily reports coming from artist support organizations such as the Future of Music Coalition, notes the precarious nature of health insurance for artists. Many of the factors that are related to reduced access for health insurance for artists include affordability, of course, but even the Future of Music Coalition cited that insurance companies sometimes view artists as high risk based on their sort of lifestyle behaviors. And also, of course, contingent freelance employment limits access. And then there are union membership requirements. So for example, if you're an actor and you might get your health insurance from the Actors Equity Association, there are very specific requirements for maintaining your union membership that are requirements based on the amount that you work. And so if you don't work a certain amount, then you're not part of that union, and therefore you lose your access to health insurance. So there's a lot of precarious factors for even accessing health insurance for many artists in the United States. Prior to 2014, these reports suggested that around 80% of artists had some form of health insurance, which you might think is quite high, but this does vary extensively among different types of artists. So 43% for musicians, 21% of writers, for example. But more so, artists are much more likely to pay for their own health insurance, so out of pocket, than compared to other workers. So the estimate is between 39% and 51% versus 6% of all other workers pay for their own health insurance out of pocket, which is a fairly substantial cost. So for example, my brother is an industrial designer. He works freelance. He pays for his own health insurance. He has a pre-existing condition, and his out-of-pocket costs on a monthly basis are close to $3,000. So it's a fairly substantial cost. So the research design and data we use data from the American Community Survey, which is a representative sample survey from the US Census Bureau. We use data from the 2010 to 2017 samples. And we use two difference in difference models to estimate the causal effect of this program on health insurance coverage. So this is just take-up rates for artists, and then we compare these effects to other groups of non-artist workers. We use two research designs that leverages the variability and the expansions that took place as a result of the ACA. The first research design compares states that did and did not expand Medicaid eligibility in 2014. And then the second design compares young adults who are and are not eligible to receive insurance through their parents due to the YA mandate. So this uses a cutoff for age of those who are and who are not eligible. And then again, we use this variability in the states that expanded versus the states that didn't to estimate the causal impact. The findings then are pretty significant. So first, the ACA implementation increased rates of health insurance among artists through newly available sources of coverage. So we saw overall a positive effect of the ACA on artist populations for access to healthcare. The YA mandate specifically led to a causal increase in employer-sponsored insurance rates, so the ECI rate of 10.7 points, and any coverage of 6.6 points for ages 21 through 25-year-old artists. And so we can start to think about the implications here, especially on the young artist who's entering the artistic workforce for the first time, especially and having access to this social program in starting their careers. The Medicaid expansion led to an increase in Medicaid coverage among artists below the poverty level of 12.4 percentage points. So again, a sizable increase for this particular population. And what was even more notable from our findings was that these insurance impacts were larger than those for non-artist worker groups. So there was a disproportionate effect on artist workers as a result of the ACA compared to non-artist workers. And this, again, Kosoli Simon, one of our health economists on the paper, is very well versed in understanding the overall impact of the ACA on other workforce sectors. So this was something that was quite of interest to her as well, looking at this occupationally specific group. And then finally, we found evidence that the ACA expansion substituted for other forms of coverage. And this was demonstrated by a decrease in the rate of self-purchased coverage accompanying the effect of the YA mandate, and a reduction in ESI and self-purchased coverage accompanying the Medicaid expansion. And so, as I previously mentioned, many artists do pay out of pocket for their health insurance. So having some kind of federally sponsored program did in fact decrease the rate of out-of-pocket costs for this particular occupation. So all in all, these were the findings that we had. There are a number of, this is one paper, again, we wrote a couple of years ago, so it's fun to talk about it. But there are a number of other papers I'm working on right now that are in the same vein, understanding how artists generally work, what their work behavior looks like in the artist labor market, and then coupling policies and programs that are designed for other work sectors and the work sector as a whole to understand how those affect the artistic labor market. And then that provides us with some insight for how artists respond to policies and not, and provides us for obviously insight for how to design these and tailor them for artist work groups. So that's all I had. And at this point, I will turn it over to my colleagues, Marco and Frederic, and let them present before we open the discussion. So thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Joanna. Perfect time as well. So Frederic and Marco, now let's listen to the European perspective.
With pleasure. So first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. What we will do in, let's hope, 15 minutes is to present you, well, the outcome of our research on cross-border employment in the live performance sector. This is actually a multidisciplinary research because Marco is the legal expert in cross-border labor law, I would say. And then it was also together with Professor Jorens, Yves Jorens from Ghent University, expert in social security law. And well, personally, well, I'm busy with labor mobility. So about this project, the reality in Europe is that there is an increase of course, labor mobility. I think we should not narrow it to only labor migration. No, reality is that there is an increasing importance of temporary labor mobility. We see an increase of seasonal workers, posted workers, so providing a service abroad. But we also have the category of highly mobile workers. There is no specific place of employment for that group of workers. You could consider their place of work the European Union. And yeah, that reality is definitely the case in road freight transport, for instance, but might also be the case in the live performance sector. And that's why we focused in this study on the live performance sector. Next slide, Marco. Well, very brief, the research objective of our study. Well, the reality in European Union is that we do not have a really good view on, well, what is the employment in the live performance sector. I will provide you some figures. Also, the number of employers active in the live performance sector. And it becomes even more complicated if we would have a good view on the transnational dimension of the live performance sector. It's also what we have tried to estimate. Then, well, in the context of providing services abroad, we see the legal framework that should be applied when applying your social security, but also in terms of labor law. We see some gaps in transnational social protection, but we see also different challenges and obstacles, both for employers and for workers involved. What we have tried to do is to map these challenges and obstacles, and also try to come up with some solution. Marco will give more information about this legal framework and some of the challenges, and also of some solutions. What I will do is briefly present you some data. Before doing that, some words about the research methodology. What I already mentioned, it was a multidisciplinary approach. Based on data from Eurostat, we have tried to map life performance sector. And perhaps something new, and perhaps also something interesting for you, is the use of the Orbis database, because Orbis gives you the opportunity to have a good view on companies' information, their how much workers, their turnover, this kind of information. So this Orbis database is available for all companies in the world. So it's not limited to European companies. And on the basis of that database, we have tried to estimate also the number of employers active in the life performance sector. Next to that, we also use data on the export and import of services, also organized an online questionnaire, and had several panel discussion and export interviews. Brings me to the figures. Well, we estimated that there are around 800,000 companies active in the life performance sector, based on the NACE code, and also based on that information, and that is calculated on based on information from the European Labour Force Survey. We estimate that there are around 1.3 million persons active in the life performance sector. But what you will read also in the report is that this, I think, a huge underestimation of the reality. I think here we see a similar picture as in the United States, because it was mentioned 35% self-employed. Here you see also for European perspective that some 4 out of 10 persons active in that sector are considered self-employed. They also have a non-standard, atypical working time arrangement. We consider that non-standard, atypical from the perspective, the European perspective. I think from the US perspective, it can be perhaps considered as standard, but from our perspective, certainly it's non-standard because of, well, it's mostly part-time, fixed-term project, task-based work. And well, that reality also may complicate also the challenges in terms of social protection. Next slide. Well, so we also tried to map the transnational dimension of the life performance sector. Was rather complicated, but I think we have some, well, interesting findings. First of all, there is certainly a transnational dimension in that life performance sector compared to other sector of activities in the European Union. Another reality is that there is a large group of companies that do not provide services abroad, but the group of companies performing art doing almost exclusively providing services abroad. So that is some contrast, I would say. Another observation is that the period abroad is mostly limited to a few days. And that is also, again, in contrast to the overall picture, what we see when you provide services abroad. It's mostly 3-4 months. So that was very brief, some basic statistics on the life performance sector, and also on the transnational dimension. So I now give the floor to Marco.
Right. So coming to the legal and social security aspect of our report, I will focus, of course, only on a couple of fundings, hoping to get your curiosity and have you check our report, which is, of course, available on the website. It will be at the end of the presentation. So now in the European Union, we do not have, for those who are not familiar at all with the European system, we do not have one single federal system of social security, but instead a coordination of 27 national systems. This is done through the coordinating regulations, which are European level regulations. Basically, the main principle is the lex loci laboris, so social security should be in the country where the work is performed. These coordination regulations, what they do is they identify one country, one member state, which should be responsible for the social security of the worker, in our case, of the artist. This, of course, gets more complicated when you face transnational situations. We have two main possibilities. One is posting, which is the situation where a worker works normally in one country, is sent to another one temporarily to provide a service, in our case, let's say a live performance, while continuing his or her employment with the original employer. The second possibility is pluriactivity, also called simultaneous employment, where the same person works on multiple jobs in different countries at the same time or in the same time period, let's say. In the case of posting, the affiliation to Social Security will remain in the country of origin from which the worker or artist is posted. In case of multi-activity, pluriactivity, it is more complicated. The first rule, let's say, is that the affiliation will remain in the country of residence if the worker performs substantial activity there. Now, when this interacts with the live performance sector, there are a certain number of things that complicate the situation. I will point out only the main elements. So mobility, as Frederic has said, in this sector is often very short term. And also, and this is a different element, can cover multiple member states, multiple countries over a period. The example is, of course, touring, where the same worker might work just for a few days or even hours in one country and then move to another and then another and another in a relatively short time period. Also, workers in this sector have, as we have heard, multiple contracts with multiple employers, and in a way interacting with the discussion over self-employment, they might have these different contracts under different qualifications. They might be over the same period or even at the same time employees in one situation and self-employed in another. So this creates several difficulties, and I've picked up just three difficulties that we have highlighted in our report. So in the case of simultaneous employment, so as I told you, a person works at the same time or over the same period for different employers in different countries. So the problem is that the coordination regulation have a rule where the affiliation to Social Security is attracted to the member state where the person has an employment relationship. And it only excludes very marginal activities. So you might have the situation where someone's main activity is working as a freelancer, so a self-employed or independent contractor, depending on the terminology, in one country. But then he or she also has a smaller but not insignificant activity as an employee in another country, say a musician who works as a freelancer in an orchestra in one country and then also works as a music teacher for 1 day a week in a different country. This is not particularly difficult, especially if you live in a border region, which in Europe abound. So in this situation, the social security of this person will be attracted to a country where maybe he or she does not have a residence, nor the main center of his or her activities. Second, in the situation of posting, the rules, the application of the coordination regulation require 1 month of prior affiliation in the country from which the person will be posted. This as a reason for existing to avoid fraud and forum shopping. But of course, in the context of the live performance sector, it creates a problem where artists are often hired immediately to be sent abroad for a live performance, even more so in the case of a replacement placements. So in this situation, it is very difficult to prove the 1 month prior affiliation in the country from which they are posted. Finally, I mentioned the interaction of different status, and it is interesting compared to the statistics of the importance of self-employment in this area. Several countries, particularly in continental Europe, France might be the best example, have in their law provisions which establish a presumption of employment for artists, a rebuttable presumption, but generally speaking, artists are employees of the person or company who uses their services, which means their social security systems work very much on the on special statuses for artists, like intermittent or intermittent for France, who take into account the specific patterns of the artistic profession, which has periods of inactivity followed by periods of activity, and so on and so forth. So in this situation, artists are expected to contribute to this scheme as employees. Now, they might, however, go at a certain point abroad to another country while maintaining their employment situation in the country of origin, go to another country and there work as freelancers, because in this other country, the norm for their profession is to work as freelancer. Now they must pay contribution in the country of origin, but the country of origin expects them to pay contribution as employees. So this creates a problem for them and requires specific arrangements and in general complicates their mobility. Now, all these challenges are there and were identified by our project. Now, looking at the future a little bit, there are unfortunately bad news for these challenges, because there are ongoing negotiations on the revision of the coordination regulation, and they actually go into the direction of more rigid application of certain situations, like the 1 month prior affiliation. Here I've mentioned the document A1. I will not go into detail over that. I do not have the time, but if you're curious, please ask away. So this might make it even more difficult for artists to fall into the category of posting and fulfilling this condition. Again, these stricter conditions are somewhat justified by situations of fraud and avoidance, which might, however, not unfortunately arise from the live performance sector, leading to the second point, which is that in general, so far, the European legislator has now a policy approach which tries to avoid exceptions or sectoral exceptions because of the fear that other situations might fall into the, let's say, wrong category through optimization and legal construction. So there is no exception for artists in sight for these rules. There are also good news, and of course I kept this for my last point. There are slow but continuous improvement in the area of digital sharing of data on the European so-called European Social Security Pass or European Single Social Security Identifier, which should make it easier not to unify the system of social security at European level, but to make it easier to authorities in each country to know the status of a given person, which should require so less bureaucracy when you go to another country. And also there is an approach which leads to improvement on the access to information, the standardization of information through the work of the newly created European Labour Authority, which oversees very much transnational employment situations. So that having been said, I hope that I have managed to get you a little bit curious about the situation of mobile workers in live performance in Europe. If you have any questions, of course, we are available. And for the rest, check the report on the website linked in our slide. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much to Frederic and Marco for your presentation of the European situation. Before jumping in the conversation, I would like to collect already a comment from Stephen Shepherd, who says, I'm particularly interested in the impact of differential health insurance availability in the US on artists' location choices. Any evidence that artists might migrate or choose locations in response to medical expansion or the operations of the local health insurance exchange? So this question is for you, Joanna.
Yeah, and I don't have an answer. So it's a really good question. But the next step of this research is honestly to understand what the effect is on the work behavior of artists. So this would be one area, I think, as well, because I was also very interested in also how this affects sort of self-employment choices and choices in contingent employment. So I think this would definitely fall there. So one thing I'll do right after this talk, honestly, is look up any other evidence on other worker sectors to see whether or not there are migrational implications for it, for health insurance as well. So I don't have an answer, but what a good question.
Terrific. We have a Sunil. Sunil, could you please briefly introduce yourself before asking your question or making your comment?
Yeah, great. Thank you. And I think there was another comment.
And please
in the
remember
chat
to unmute yourself. And
yes, I'm
yeah,
Sunil
let's
Iyengar.
alternate.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
All right, great. I'm Sunil Iyengar, Director of Research at the National Endowment for the Arts in the US. Really great presentations, really enlightening. Thank you. I had a question, really, Joanna, in your, I was intrigued by your statement up front, which, I'm looking forward to the book, but the sort of juxtaposition of extrinsic benefits with kind of this looking at the sort of the behaviors and the work patterns as your research is really investigating, and also what we saw from from the others. I just wanted to know, in a way, is there a way of linking those? Is there a framework for thinking about how we understand better security, the Medicaid and Medicare access, and on the other hand, from the other presentation, understanding mobility and security around mobility. How do those factors, is there a way to kind of link those factors to outcomes related to, economic outcomes of these artists? Or maybe, not just looking at the fact of employment as an outcome, but, higher wages for the artists? Are there ways of understanding, just from a policy perspective, I'm wondering if there's a way to connect that research, a body of research, with some of these extrinsic benefits, to be frank. And I don't know if there are thoughts about that or directions to take the research, which is wonderful, of course.
What a great question. So the reason I take this perspective, first off, is that we tend to not see policies be designed for exceptional circumstances. And I think at least in the United States, there's a growing advocacy movement for creative workers that portrays them in an exceptional nature. And personally, I think that's a dead end for artist policy in the US. So I take this perspective that instead of promoting this workforce as exceptional, we promote them as any other worker. And therefore you start with the stance that the individual has an occupational choice to make, and that occupational choice is their decision. So there's a freedom of occupational choice that's afforded to every single person in this country. And then in this world, and most developed nations have this sort of perspective that there's a freedom of occupational choice afforded to people. And if you allow that to take place, then there are obviously efficiencies to be gained in the economic market. For example, the identification of innate talent and skill sets for people being able to freely choose their occupation. And there's a long sort of political economic literature on this very topic. So that's where I'm grounding this. But I think your question is a really good one, because right now we tend to sort of look at, we tend to jump to the outcomes in understanding what it is we're trying to do in artist policy. So we're jumping to, oh, well, we'll provide all of these ultimate benefits to society if we just support this one artistic workforce. But I think we're sort of skipping the output step, where we need to think about, well, actually, how first do we get it such that artists or individuals have access to satisfying careers in their occupation of choice, and then take the next step in linking that to the outcomes that provides for an economic system or society as a whole. So I guess what I'm advocating in this book is that we jump ahead when we're really not ready to take that step in the first place. But I think your idea is, I might steal it. So
no, I love it. I love it. No, I think, sorry, I'll be quiet. Though, just a comment. I think what you said about the efficiency of the labor system, of the market, and understanding like any other sector, there's an ease of an ability to match the talent with the demand, and that this is happening in a free market in our case. I mean, I think it's wonderful. That itself is a frame for, as you say, for understanding some of these outputs. It's really, really exciting. Thank you.
Thank you. And perhaps before the output, the process of being an artist, but let's listen to the European perspective. Frederic and Marco, do you have any comments related to this question? And if there is anybody from the audience representing other geographical areas in the world, you are more than welcome to bring your cases.
Yes, I mean, our perspective is a little bit different on this, because we do not come from a bottom up, let's say, artist social protection, but more of our mobile artist social protection, which in a way skews our vision, because as Frederic pointed out, only a part of the sector is mobile, although that part is incredibly mobile. So in our perspective, let's say this question of process and output, where does it point to? In our perspective, there is let's say a system that works in a very old-fashioned way, if you want, focusing on a very classical form of mobility, which is more or less for long-term and more or less stable, etc. And it's not very well adapted, let's say, to these forms of mobility. But interestingly, in this idea that workers, I mean, artists are workers, this improving on this point would not just improve on live performance, but actually would also improve on other forms of employment, which are more and more common in terms of high mobility. So in a way, I really like this approach of saying, well, this is actually, I mean, those are workers. They might be also artists, but in many cases they are. So these should be really the focus on pragmatic solutions to improve to facilitate mobility, because for the rest of this debate we would have to go back to much more national level, because it's there that the social security is organized from in the European system, and we do not want to get into this, and our research did not deal on that.
Yeah. Well, the only thing I can add in this discussion is that you could link, I think, the development of the coordination rules 83/2004, as mentioned by Marco, that was developed already 60 years ago in the European Union. Well, that was the idea was we should promote, guarantee free movement of workers at that time. Now it's a much broader framework, but that idea still stands, I think. So there is still the idea, okay, we should avoid that there is a burden, and we should guarantee a good transnational social protection to avoid any gaps in social security protection when you are mobile in the European Union. And that might be the case for the highly mobile worker. That might be the case for a group of artists. And for the moment, it might also complicate, as presented also by Marco, the reality for the employers, of course. But I think from a European perspective, I would always link how you develop your social security coordination to, well, guarantee free movement of workers, freedom to provide services abroad.
Frederic, I just wanted to note that's such a, it's a very aligned with my perspective too, that this idea that we're constantly I'm constantly thinking about how to integrate artist labor markets within the greater workforce, so the greater sector. And I think this is exactly what you're talking about. This is not just mobility of artist workers, but mobility of workers. And we're focusing here on artists. But another good example is in the United States, the burden of student debt, right? So we have this student debt problem, and that's a problem for a lot of individuals, not only artists. And so in the book and most of my work, I focus really on what is it of what are the unique behaviors of artists with regard to higher education And how does that grow? How does that contribute to the student debt problem that we see for the workforce as a whole and for the nation as a whole? And how can we think about altering that system so not only artists are affected positively, but also thinking about how to alter that system for the problems that we see in that overall system in itself. So I guess like that's a very similar perspective to how I look at this. And so even we might say that we have a universal perspective despite us being across the sea from one another. So
we have a comment and a question from Carol Borowiecki, sorry, from Denmark. Carol says, thank you for 2 great talks. So there is a comment for, and the question for Federico and Marco. The comment is most performing arts companies may not perform abroad, but many perform for audiences from abroad, tourists, etc. I guess this would be something related to trans-border activity, even if not only indirectly. And the question is, I was surprised by the very high number of companies relative to employees, about less than 1.5 employees per company on average. Is this driven by many one-person companies or multiple employments of performers? So who would like to respond, Federico?
Perhaps,
or
Marco, I will start with the second question related to, yeah, true. It's the case. It was mentioned in the presentation. Yeah, 4 out of 10 are self-employed, but yeah, 7 out of 10 companies we have identified that are active in the live performance sector are one-person companies. So that explains, of course, that it's only 1.5. So there are really a high number of very small businesses. What I also should refer to is, of course, another partner involved in our project, namely Pearl, because Pearl was involved in this project as employer association within European Union. And I see also Anita de Baer is also attending this webinar. So Anita, if you would like to bring in some input on your experience, of course, on the ground, I would say, in terms of the profile of the companies active in the live performance sector, I think that would be very useful for us.
And I will just add one word on the first. Oh, here's.
Yes, I don't know if Anita is there.
Hello. Good afternoon, everyone. Might have a little bit of an echo, so I hope you can hear me. I'm not in the best room here. Thanks to Marco and Frederic for the presentation. We were indeed involved in this research. What is typical to Europe is that indeed we have a lot of smaller companies. That also has to do with the fact that a lot of artists are self-employed and they may perhaps be sole traders and also subcontract other people for specific tasks, but indeed that is a common trend. At the same time, we have larger companies, if you would like to call it, often public bodies like opera houses, etc. But the number of people that they employ is not immensely huge either. I mean, they would still qualify as small and medium-sized enterprises with 1,000 employees or 500 employees, which we would count already as a relatively big employer. So that is why it explains that percentage-wise we have a lot of smaller ones. Then what is also very typical is the kind of employers who have a very small core number of employees, the administrative people, I would say, and then they recruit according to the project. So there may be at times, depending when the calculation happens, so Eurostat should almost calculate per week, and then you should take the average. But if you only do it at a certain moment in time, when at that moment just only the administrative persons are there, but on other times they might have a group of 30 persons that are employed, but it is because they work project by project. What I found very interesting, Joanna, about your presentation, and I've heard because of the COVID crisis also colleagues from the US talking about the health insurance system. What I find as a topic quite different in the European Union, because there's a lot of talking about European status of the artist at the moment, is the access to unemployment benefits. Why is that? Because as Frederic and Marco were saying, you have irregular patterns of employment, you fall in between, and artists are looking for a kind of stabilization of their income. And in Europe, it's quite common, especially when you're employed, that you can access unemployment insurance. And this is a topic very high on the agenda at the moment. It would be more the point of discussion in Europe than what I see as a point of discussion in the US, just to compare the two continents.
Thank you very much, Anita, for bringing your testimonial. And there is in the chat a conversation on the differences and correspondingly in terms of social protection between artists being employees or independent or company owners. So you highlighted how there are discrepancies in terms of social protection depending on the status of being an artist in terms of employment. I would like to ask to all speakers a methodological question, because artist labor markets and social protection, as you pointed out, are a rather complex matter, and not only in economics. And you also highlighted how an interdisciplinary approach, or a multidisciplinary, or a transdisciplinary, because we have also practice representatives here, very, very present. So could you please explain to us what has been perhaps the most difficult challenge in terms of methodology you dealt with?
Please, Joanna, you first.
Oh, sure. Well, I think there is always the question that everyone asks about, well, how do you define the artist? That's one of the major questions I always get on every single piece of research I have. And then and my answer to that question is, I think, to be honest, we need to be less concerned about defining the artist as opposed to understanding artistic work. So I'm not so concerned about who defines as an artist or who doesn't, because I don't think that's a stable definition. We change our occupations over the course of a lifetime. We work in different jobs. Artists are very well known to toggle between occupations and even work in multiple markets. So I tend to think that we should be much more interested on the nature of artistic work and how to go about promoting or understanding the productivity of artistic work as opposed to who is an artist. So I think that's a major methodological limitation that I met with, at least by reviewers of all of my papers and people who are interested in my work.
Thank you, Joanna. Definitions are tough in cultural economics, and not only. Frederic and Marco, what about your research?
Frederic,
methodological
go on, go with the
challenges.
definition.
The main challenge, actually.
Will not say hope. I think, well, we had a lot of discussion about the concept of what is a highly mobile worker, because this is an increasing, but there's increasing attention for that concept in the European Union, European Commission, but it makes very, the interpretation of it and the definition of it is very complex, I think. But I suppose Marco will say some additional things about that. The only thing I would like to say when you talk about methodology is, well, the reality, at least for the European Union, is that there's really a lack of data, good data on, okay, what's the importance of the life performance sector in terms of employers and in terms of workers, self-employed, involved. So there, I think steps has to be taken, for instance, by Eurostat, but for instance also by OECD, to better quantify the importance of the life performance sector. And then, of course, the additional step is to try to quantify the importance of the cross-border aspects in life performance. So from a methodological point of view, I consider this as certainly as important.
I'll add one more. I think also choosing the appropriate control group. And I'm, understanding who are we comparing to. So if you look at any occupation, well, what is normal? What are we supposed to be? What is the ideal equilibrium state that we're trying to approach? And you have to have some sort of control group, and that's always very difficult for work on a specific occupation.
Yes, so as the lawyer of the group, more on a methodological aspect on multidisciplinary work, and it is sometimes difficult to reconcile the need for a macro vision of economists with a very micro and individual level in the end decisions that the law has to take on who gets access to these benefits or not, and in the end you look sufficiently close, and all decisions are very individual and dictated by single situations, even more so at the level of the European Union law, where the case law of the Court of Justice is so massively important because of the difficulty of advancing legislation at the European Union level. So this kind of interaction between trying to define a sector, define a highly mobile worker, and then getting confronted all the time with individual decisions of the Court of Justice, and then going down to single administrations and social security institutions where you actually go and talk with people and you say, well, the law says this and it's a problem, and they say, no, it's not a problem because we just more or less ignore it and we find a solution. It's like, yeah, thank you. And this is difficult to report on. But so this in terms of multidisciplinary collaboration is of course a challenge, and you can see this immediately in this debate when Joanna says, yeah, who cares who's an artist? Well, I care because in order to fit in the French social security system as an intermittent worker of this sector, you need to work in a specific set of activities. So there must be a definition, and people have a clear interest on falling in this definition because it is relatively, as it can be in the age of austerity, generous. So in a way, at the level of description and policy making, I do agree that these strict definitions are, in the end, not the main thing. But then again, I go down and I meet the individual level and I say, yeah, they still matter to some extent. So here's the tension between different approaches that we try to keep together in our report as well.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, the hour has passed. We had a lot of interesting insights. I would like to thank you very much for bringing key points to us, such as the importance of occupational motivations, the fact of being self-employed, the need from the policy perspective to get frameworks to support the decision making, and before that understanding, but the point was on human beings, on workers as well as artists. So in the chat, I put the link to the YouTube channel, so where you can find former cultural economics online seminars, including this one, if you'd like to rewatch it, and if you'd like to propose a particular topic to be dealt with in one of our CEOs, please don't hesitate to contact me at my email address. But I would like to thank once again Joanna Woronkowicz, Frederic de Wispelaere, and Marco Rocca for their great contributions today, and also to the great questions and comments from the audience. Thank you so much, and see you in 2 weeks at our next Cultural Economics online seminar.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.